Redditors who quit their jobs in a blaze of glory. What's your story? Story 1. Told the office manager that he couldn't organize a successful Girl Scout cookie drive, let alone run a business. On the way out, I told him I was going to report him to the state labor board for making everyone work 8.5 hours a day without lunch. The state made him cut me a check for 2.5 years of missed lunches. Story 2. This is sort of the opposite, but whatever. I was working for a tech startup in '98 that was growing by leaps and bounds, and one day they reorganized the department and promoted this guy, let's call him Teddy, who had been there for like 2 weeks, to manager. He had 4 or 5 people working for him, and he treated them all like crap. They were all self-motivated, senior-level people, and he treated them like children. He micromanaged their work, berated everything they did, and complained whenever they had to leave for something like a dentist appointment or a sick kid. When he first took over, he tried to enforce a policy where none of them could check in code unless he reviewed it in person and then did the check-in himself. That lasted less than 2 weeks. He reviewed an already approved schedule for a software release, decided it wasn't aggressive enough, told his superiors they were going to move it up by 3 months, and then ordered everyone to work weekends. Not because there was a business need, but because he wanted to prove he could get things done. After a few months, this woman, let's call her Kelly, who worked for him, gave her 2 weeks' notice, saying she had been offered a managerial job at another company. Teddy lost it. You could hear him screaming through the walls of his office, and then as she walked out, he followed her to the exit, shouting the whole time, "You're fucking worthless, Kelly. You're going to fail. Don't come crawling back looking for a job. I'm glad to see you go. Now I can hire someone with real skills," and so on. For at least a month after she was gone, he would randomly say things like, "I can't believe that bitch just up and left. What a cunt." Or, "Oh, Kelly really fucked things up good. We're probably going to miss our release date because of how she left things." HR sat down with him privately to talk, and then he just started bitching about HR. They're covering their asses so they don't get sued. They don't give a shit about good company men like me. A few months later, our company was acquired, and we went to the welcome meeting the new company had set up. Their CTO and VP of development each spent about half an hour talking about strategic vision, how the changes would affect us, the usual stuff, and then the VP said, "But there will be at least one familiar face to help with the transition. I think most of you know Kelly Johnson. She used to work here. She'll be the senior manager in charge of the products team moving forward." So, everyone looked back at Teddy, who was white as a sheet and looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He was gone within a month. Story 3. Working at a wings place just out of college as a cook. I started working there and everything was going okay, except for the fact that I was really underpaid. I was making minimum wage as one of only 2 cooks in the restaurant. After a few months, the manager sat down to talk with me. We discussed a few things, and I brought up the fact that I really deserved a raise. I was working 50 to 60 hours a week, and the compensation based on my effort really wasn't balancing out. He basically told me to fuck off, and that cooks were a dime a dozen. I told him I was disappointed with his retort. Times were tough for me then, so I bit my lip and just went back to work. The next few months were hell. The manager would openly put me down in front of other employees and constantly berate me for asking for more money. He'd schedule me for back-to-back-to-back opening and closing shifts and purposely send people home so I'd be the only one left to clean the kitchen at the end of the night. I was starting to lose my patience with this job. Finally, Super Bowl Sunday rolled around, and for those who don't know, it's one of the busiest days of the year for restaurants that make wings. I got into work and everyone was already pissed. I asked what was up, and they told me the other cook hadn't shown up and nothing was prepped for the day. I rolled up my sleeves and started working. We got everything set up, and I began cranking out wings for the flood of orders. The phones were ringing non-stop, and honestly, there were more orders than the restaurant could handle. It was total chaos. In the middle of this, my manager came up to me and started giving me the same crap as always. Then some of his friends, not employees, wandered into the kitchen and started messing with my stuff, moving things around, disorganizing everything, even sitting on my prep counters. I told them to get the fuck out, and my manager stormed in, completely losing it on me. He screamed that I was a worthless piece of shit, that I never did anything right, that I wasn't worth more than minimum wage, and that I never put in any extra effort. That was it. Something in my brain just clicked, and I stopped giving a damn about anything. I stood up straight, stretched out my arms wide, slowly took off my apron, and removed my hat. I stared directly into my manager's eyes and calmly but firmly said, "Have an enjoyable Super Bowl Sunday." I tossed my apron and hat straight into the fry oil basins, grabbed my bag, and walked past the rest of the employees, whose jaws were practically on the floor, and out the back door to the ever-fading sound of phones ringing off the hook. I got home, told my roommates the story, and we decided to order 200 wings and watch the game. Story 4. Growing up in a small town, the guy who umpired all the Little League games was great at it, but he had some issues. He was somewhere on the autism spectrum. Like a lot of folks with autism, he could pick one thing, focus on it, and be really good at it. His thing was baseball. At the end of the Little League season, the coaches wanted to hold a tournament with all the teams in town. I think there were about 6. It hadn't been planned for, so the city didn't budget anything. Everyone pitched in to get the fields ready, and the umpire was more than happy to volunteer to ump the games. Since it was an extra, thrown-together tournament, some parents started giving the ump a hard time. By the time it got to the championship game, one guy in particular was ruthless. Eventually, the umpire had enough. He ripped off his mask and lost it on the guy, shouting, "Fuck you. I've had enough of your shit. You want a fucking umpire for this game? Do it your fucking self." He went on like that for a couple minutes, then got on his bike and rode away. Another parent, who had played college baseball, stepped in to umpire, and the asshole parent was told to get the fuck out. The sad part is that the original umpire never worked for the recreation department again. The one thing he could do really well, the thing that gave him a place, was taken away from him. There wasn't even a trophy or a prize in this tournament. It was just an opportunity for a bunch of 11-year-olds to play a few more games. Fuck, man. Now I'm pissed. Story 5. I used to work in an aquatic center many moons ago. I'd been there for several years, and all my colleagues were really good people, intelligent and passionate about the business. The company owner, however, took real liberties with his staff. He paid less than minimum wage, pushed employees to work far beyond their job descriptions, and was generally an arsehole on top of it. One employee in particular had worked there for years, harder than everyone else, and was made to do the owner's personal errands like his laundry and cleaning his car, all while being paid next to nothing. He used that meager pay to support his ill mom, who he lived with. The problem was that nobody ever spoke up against the owner because everyone needed their jobs. As bad as the pay was, it was still better than nothing. The day I decided I was leaving, I prepared a hefty stack of legal documents and a note. The note essentially stated that, firstly, I was resigning from my job, but secondly, here was a list of all the times he had underpaid staff illegally, overworked them, taken advantage of them, paid cash in hand under the table, dodged taxes, and generally been a shitty boss. I explained that he had gotten away with it so far, but it was only a matter of time before the staff he tread on either rose up against him or left. I told him it only took one message from any staff member to land him in serious trouble, but they hadn't done it. I told him he needed to start taking care of his staff, treating them with respect, and paying them fairly. I never heard back from the boss himself, but the following evening I got a call from one of the employees saying the boss had come in that day, given everyone a pay rise, increased holiday days, and personally thanked them for their hard work. Not exactly a blaze of glory, but I'm happy I managed to help those who stayed. Story 6. Not me, but a co-worker of mine when I was working in a high-pressure sales department. This man still has legend status, even 10 years later. A little background first. The men there would always try to hit on the very few women who worked in the office. They treated us like sex objects, but honestly, I didn't really care. It was more sad than anything. They were like these perpetual virgins who somehow also thought they were God's gift to women. One night at a work party, one of the guys, let's call him Brian, brought his wife. Another sales dude got drunk and started hitting on her. And when I say hitting on her, I mean he actually started touching her inappropriately. His wife first ignored him, and eventually, she and Brian just left the party. But when Brian found out what had really happened, he was furious. Fast forward a few months. The company was reorganizing, and some people had to be let go. Brian was one of them. He knew it was coming and already had another job lined up. So Brian goes into the office, gets his notice, and walks out. But he doesn't sit back down at his desk. Instead, he walks straight over to sales dude, taps him on the shoulder, and punches him square in the face. Cool as a cucumber, Brian then walked back to his desk, picked up his stuff, and calmly left the office, never to be heard from again. Story 7. It wasn't exactly a blaze, but it was the best feeling. My husband and I were working at a shitty call center while in university. We had already gotten notice that the company didn't get its contract renewed and would be shutting down. Things got intense because people kept quitting, and they had just launched the iPhone 5, so the calls were insane. Angry customers nonstop, asking where their phones were, call after call. One day during lunch, I told my husband I couldn't stand it anymore and suggested that we just not say anything, just walk out the door. Normally when I said stuff like that on a stressful day, he would calm me down, make me laugh, and I'd get through it. But that day he just said, "Okay." So we gathered our things, walked out of the building, and never went back. That night we walked the full hour home together. Our lunch period usually fell around sunset, and the day was beautiful. I remember the sky being this glowing, fiery red, and the lake we walked past looked like it was on fire. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace and freedom. I felt like I could actually breathe. We walked in silence most of the way home. It was perfect. Story 8. Not me, but two people I worked with. I was at a sushi restaurant that had a really high turnover rate. The reason was one of the owners. She was a huge bitch who loved to yell at people. I saw people come and go, most lasting only a few days. There was a sushi chef who had been there for a while, though. He was pretty cool, and we got along great when we worked together. His girlfriend also worked there as a cashier, and a lot of times they were scheduled together. One Saturday when I was supposed to be off, I got a call from Carol, the bitch boss, asking if I could come in. Apparently, Max and his girlfriend had finally had enough of her and both straight up walked out of the restaurant. The place was small, so usually it was just the cooks in the back, the sushi chef, and the cashier, delivery driver. When they left, they basically left the place empty aside from the cooks, who didn't speak English very well. I decided to take the shift for the extra money, and when I got there, Carol was already behind the sushi prep area making orders. She normally never came in on weekends, but she would watch the security cameras from her laptop at home and call to yell at you if she saw you standing around doing nothing. That's exactly what she did to Max and his girlfriend, and they finally had enough. Carol even showed me the security footage, Max yelling at her over the phone, hanging up, then taking off his apron while both he and his girlfriend flipped off the camera before walking out. She showed me the footage because she couldn't believe how disrespectful they were and how they could just leave the restaurant when customers were still inside. Personally, I thought it was pretty badass that they walked out together. I know I wanted to quit hundreds of times when I worked there, but I was a broke college student who needed the money. Last I heard, they both got jobs at the sushi place competing with ours. Story 9. After working there for over 2 years, starting at the bottom when there were only 3 employees, including me, and eventually becoming supervisor, manager, I was long overdue for a raise. The boss kept putting off our meeting to discuss it, and I had even prepped a small presentation to show what I had accomplished in my position over the past year. The meeting day finally came, and I spoke for about 15 minutes to justify the raise I was asking for. But instead of a negotiation, I was told my work had been unsatisfactory and they no longer wanted me to act as supervisor. This was a complete shock, since they had never given me any negative feedback about how I was running things, and they let me plead my case for a raise seconds before terminating my responsibilities. Of course, they said they'd love for me to stay at the company to train new hires at my current, crappy salary, doing entry-level tasks whenever there wasn't active training. They also expected me to remain in the supervisor role I was supposedly failing at for another 2 to 4 months, so they'd have time to recruit my replacement, and so I could get that person up to speed. The best part? They had never once hinted at, let alone officially advised me of, any issues with the quality of my work. I walked out as soon as they were done speaking, without saying a word. A few hours later, the boss actually called asking if I would come back. The next morning, I met with HR, who expressed their apologies and surprise. They suggested I speak with the boss again to see if things could be sorted and maybe find a happy medium. So I went to his office, shut the door, and told him straight up how much of an ass he was and how he'd lost all the respect I ever had for him. I told him I would finish the week and close my open cases, without hinting to clients about how awful things were behind the scenes, in exchange for a larger severance package and being officially laid off. Turned out for the best, because I'm pretty happy where I am now. Story 10. I used to work recording concerts for my school's conservatory. Basically, students could pay a fee for the conservatory to record their concerts and put it on a CD for them. I'd had the job as a work-study since I was a freshman, and I loved it. In the second half of my senior year, I got a call from my boss saying I had messed up a CD and needed to meet him in the studio to fix it at 4 p.m. I thought that was an odd request. Mistakes happened occasionally, but all of us knew how to fix them, and I was the most experienced worker he had. I asked if I could just fix it earlier and leave it with the office assistant, but he insisted I come in at 4. I showed up about 15 minutes early to figure out what had gone wrong. I put the CD in and immediately realized it was a recording of a completely different concert. That was bizarre, but since we kept backups of all the audio, I just burned another CD of the correct concert. As the CD was burning, my boss came in and told me I was fired. He said screwing up a CD that badly was unacceptable. I had never been fired before, and this was the longest job I'd ever had, so I was blindsided. To this day, I have no idea how the wrong concert ended up on that CD. My best guess is that the office assistant mixed them up, but whoever's fault it was an easy problem to fix. I argued for a bit, saying he was making a mistake and it wasn't a big deal, but he refused to listen. Just as I had resigned myself to my fate, the freshly burned CD popped out of the computer. We both stared at it in silence for about 5 seconds. Then I laughed, handed it to him, shook his hand, and walked out. But I wasn't done. I loved that job, and I felt wronged. I was also saving up for a trip to Europe and didn't want to cancel it. I already had tickets to Wacken. With no job and no girlfriend, I suddenly had a lot of time on my hands that last semester. So I started my own business recording students' concerts using my own equipment. I charged slightly less than the conservatory and put up ads online and around campus. I advertised that I had more experience than anyone working in the conservatory's audio department. And, honestly, my gear was better for most venues, especially for jazz. Plus, instead of burning CDs, I offered digital delivery, which students loved because they'd get their recordings within an hour or two instead of waiting days. College students are cheap, so it didn't take long before I had to hire my own assistant to keep up. By the end, I'd probably cut the conservatory audio department's business by at least 20%. My former boss was furious and even tried, unsuccessfully, to shut us down. That semester, I earned more money than I probably had in my previous 3.5 years combined of working for someone else. My only regret was not starting sooner. The only downside is I don't feel comfortable putting that job on my resume anymore. Story 11. Not really a blaze of glory, but an interesting story nonetheless. In high school, I worked at a Wendy's. The store was terrible with scheduling, and since I was probably the best cashier there, I always had to work the dinner rush and close on busy nights. That meant every Friday and Saturday, I was stuck working while all my friends were out having fun. One particular week, I booked off a Friday so I could go to a party. But when the schedule came out, I was still on it. I went to the manager and reminded her I had booked it off, and she basically said, "Too bad." So I went to an employee who wasn't scheduled and convinced them to cover my shift. When I told the manager, she refused to allow it because you're the only employee with enough experience to work a Friday shift. I also happened to work the Thursday that week, and during that shift, a customer called the store to compliment me. That meant I was supposed to get a free meal on my next shift. By then, I was done. I was sick of missing out every weekend, always being scheduled, and dealing with management's crap. So I went in for my Friday shift at 4 p.m., took my break at 7 p.m., got my free meal, walked out of the restaurant, and never came back. Story 12. Was working as an expat oil company senior staff geologist and de facto exploration manager, but without the pay bump or authority, just the stress, in the Middle East for a Southern European construction company's oil and gas division. The general manager was a complete nightmare. Full of himself because he'd spent his entire career at one major oil company as an engineer, so obviously he thought he knew everything about geology, geophysics, petrophysics, etc. He didn't. His management style could best be described as inept micromanagement or management by tantrum. He'd berate and degrade the entire staff in front of partners, scream across the office about stupid things like coffee pods, or why 6,000 meters of pipe hadn't arrived even though the unpaid invoice was still sitting on his desk. In a multicultural office, he'd rant about useless Arabs, entitled expats, and goddamn jingle bunnies, his charming term for engineers from the subcontinent. Racist, sexist, misanthropic, and all-around waste of oxygen. One day, after a well I had recommended looked poor on logs, thanks to bargain basement logging contractors he took kickbacks from, he completely lost it on me. Called me every name in the book and even insulted my alma mater for giving me 3 degrees. Turns out the well actually flowed over 8,000 BOPD, but he refused to let me relog the pay zones. That was the final straw. After 26 years in the patch, I decided no job was worth this. Over drinks with other expats, I mentioned I was planning a runner. To my surprise, most of them said they'd do the same if I left. So we made a plan. The company provided housing, but we all quietly gave notice to our landlords, who were thrilled. They'd already been paid and could re-rent for double. We canceled utilities with a quick email, just in case border guards asked. Then we booked the entire business class section of a British Airways flight to London, families and all. We packed up discreetly, and by the time school let out, stress levels were at 0. We all knew we were leaving. Some locals sensed something, but we only confided in close friends, under penalty of bacon sandwiches, which they thought hilarious. Liberation Friday arrived. We rented a bus to the airport, checked in, breezed through customs, and hit the duty-free. Sitting in the pub before boarding, we toasted each other. On the plane, vodka in hand. I counted the losses. Senior staff geologist, me, senior geophysicist, senior petrophysicist, senior geomodeller, reservoir engineer, drilling engineer, operations geologist, logistics manager, senior surveyor, HSEQ manager, plus 3 secretaries. Out of 50 employees, they just lost their entire senior team. Back at the office, Sunday was chaos. The GM realized everyone had vanished. His calls hit disconnected lines. His texts went unanswered. He raged. "Where are you? Why aren't you at work? This isn't funny. Come in and we'll act like this never happened." We let him eat static. By the time we landed in London, he'd already fired the entire remaining local staff out of rage, which backfired badly. Thanks to nepotism ties, he was reported immediately. The fallout was catastrophic. Fines, loss of drilling rigs, halted wells worth millions, seismic contracts canceled, government contracts revoked, loss of acreage, national oil company poaching staff, and eventual office closure. They even had to pay locals to sit at home playing Xbox while everything collapsed. Last I heard, her GM dickhead was in South Texas, still trying to peddle shady oil deals. Only now he keeps running into people who know exactly who he is. Some even worked for him. And there's nothing sweeter than watching those people lean forward, smile, and tell him, "Fuck off. Don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. You might hurt what's left of your brain." Story 13. I'm late to the party, but I've got a story worth a few $1,000,000. This is about how my employer, a national company, tried to screw me over, and I screwed them back, harder. They overcharged customers for everything and treated employees like garbage. Turnover was around 80%. So people were just trying to hang on long enough not to get fired. I quit school to work there because of the great opportunity I was sold on. I rose quickly to manage my own store, but in retrospect it was a throne of shit. The job destroyed your social life and your health. As a manager, it was even worse. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, all for $50,000 a year. Sundays weren't even restful because I spent them dreading Monday's regional conference call. Our numbers were brutal. We had to sell and also collect credit in-house. That meant calling people with terrible credit histories, demanding payments they couldn't make. It was miserable. Still, I stayed for 5 years. Then corporate decided to test an off-site branch that sold products but didn't handle collections. Those fell to my branch. They got the credit for sales while I got the nightmare of unpaid accounts. Around the same time, all California managers were reclassified from salary to hourly, which meant more hours for the same pay. That little detail would come back to bite them. The stress got worse, and every time I complained about the off-site mess, my boss told me to fuck off. I started saving every hostile fax, recording conference calls, and printing financial reports as leverage. When he finally staged a surprise audit, he accused me of losing files. That was his excuse to fire me. What he didn't know was I still had the files, and I was ready. I immediately filed for unemployment, knowing the company always fought those claims. Sure enough, they denied me. I appealed, faced my ex-boss and a corporate lawyer in front of an arbitrator, and produced the documents they didn't know I had. Watching their faces when they realized their plan had collapsed was glorious. I won and collected unemployment for 2 years while I went back to school. But that was just the warm-up. The real blaze of glory came from the classification issue. Years earlier, the company had lost a lawsuit over how they misclassified managers. It cost them $30 million, and afterward they made us sign weekly paperwork claiming we spent over 50% of our time on managerial duties. Total bullshit, but we signed because we needed our paychecks. The kicker? Between the lawsuit and the reclassification to hourly, there was a 2-year gap where they changed nothing. Those were clear violations, and I had the paperwork to prove it. Before I was even fired, I'd been shopping law firms. Not long after my unemployment victory, I heard the company had agreed to settle for $15 million. When class action letters started going out, my ex-boss found out I was the one who started it. He called me, screaming and cursing, but I hung up on him. His rage was music to my ears. I got a nice payout, bought a car, and saved the rest for school. On top of that, I filed a separate suit just against him for the toxic environment, those abusive faxes and calls. They settled that one too. Not millions, but still a good chunk of change. I later found out his wife left him and the company dumped him. Fitting, really. He couldn't even escape the turnover he once bragged about. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But honestly, I felt like a white-collar Viking, conquering my enemies and taking their spoils. Story 14. I worked for 2 years at a major multinational, not going to say which one, but let's just say if you look up at the sky at night, you'll see it. As a researcher in the IT sector. It was my first real job, just as I was finishing grad school. The department was brand new, so around 20 to 30 of us were all hired at about the same time. Things were sketchy from the start. Within a week I realized I was one of the youngest in the team, but also the one with the lowest salary, least benefits, and the worst schedule flexibility, despite having the same position, duties, and qualifications as my colleagues. I raised the issue with my supervisor, who promised to look into it, but never did. I stuck around because I needed the paycheck and was buying my first car, but conditions quickly got worse. We had to move into a new office before it was finished. The builders were still hammering, sawing, and covering everything in concrete dust while we were expected to invent new technologies. The company's solution? They gave us construction masks and told us to work through it. They also started refusing to fund publications or scientific events, which are the way research actually matters. At one point, I got invited to a major conference with all expenses covered. The company said I could only go if I took it as unpaid leave. That was insane. These events are literally part of our jobs. At the same time, they demanded constant new projects but refused resources. Need a development team? Nope. Need new hardware to prototype? Buy it yourself. I was even pulled aside a few times and asked if I could design tech that wouldn't work on a competitor's product. I refused every time. One project I co-led was particularly innovative. Despite no resources, we pushed it as far as possible, even using my own unpaid time and money. After 1.5 years, we had working tech ready for pilot trials. But that would require other departments, and management decided it wasn't worth the effort. For the next 6 months, I made it my personal mission to prove them wrong. I did marketing, legal research, even went out myself to find potential clients and partners. It started gaining traction. Then they fired my colleague, the only other person on the project. Suddenly, I was alone. I called my boss into a room and told him straight. I wanted to be fired. I had no other job lined up, but I was done working under those conditions. I told him if they didn't fire me, I'd keep showing up, doing the bare minimum, and collecting a paycheck, since they were already making job cuts anyway. They fired me. I walked away with a decent deal, and the project died. 2 months later, I won a national award for innovation for that exact project. I'd submitted it months earlier and forgotten about it. Now the national news was all over the story. This breakthrough technology, credited to the company, invented almost single-handedly by me and my colleague, both of whom they had already fired. Reporters and clients asked why the inventors were gone and why the company couldn't reactivate the project without us. Technically, they should have been able to, but the truth was they were so incompetent and lost that they had no idea how. Story 15. I worked at a supermarket chain in Australia doing night fill. When I first applied, I was only getting 1 or 2 shifts a week at another job. By the time I got hired, that job had bumped me up to 4 or 5 shifts, but I figured I could handle both. For a while I was working 70 to 80-hour weeks. Then my grandpa's health declined badly, dementia. A month later, my nan had a massive stroke. She needed a stent put in, but the doctors couldn't operate while she was on blood thinners, and without them, she risked another stroke that would almost certainly kill her. Around the same time, my grandpa went from struggling to being a complete shell of who he was. I kept grinding through both jobs until my grandpa finally passed. Honestly, in his last month he was already gone, but breaking the news to my nan in the hospital while she was prepping for surgery was brutal. I was falling apart, so I called both jobs to say I needed a break. My first job was understanding. Take the time you need. Your job will be here when you're ready. Perfect. Then I called the supermarket night fill job. The first thing out of the manager's mouth was, "Why?" I explained that I didn't want to break down crying in front of a customer, and I thought it was best if I took 2 weeks to grieve and handle the funeral. I even clarified that I wasn't asking for paid leave since I'd only started there a few months earlier. His reply? Word for word. "I'm sorry about your dead grandpa, but it doesn't take 2 weeks to bury a body." I was speechless. Then he added, "I expect to see you at work tomorrow. Anything else?" and hung up. I was furious and devastated. At first, I couldn't even think straight, then I just snapped. Fuck him. What's the worst that happens if I don't show up? I get fired? Big deal. The only reason I took this job was because I was understaffed at my other job. Now I'm not. So fuck him. And then I thought, if I'm going out, I may as well go out big. So the next day, I didn't show up. As expected, he called. What he didn't know was that I was recording everything. I walked him through the exact same conversation we'd had the day before about my dead grandpa, my nan in surgery, and my request for unpaid leave. And he not only doubled down, he repeated the line about how it doesn't take 2 weeks to bury a body. He finished with, "You better get your ass here on time tomorrow, or your fucking ass is fired." Got it all on tape. Story 16. I was a server in a really crappy restaurant owned by a husband and wife. The wife was the one who actually kept things running. She worked hard and got most things done. The husband, on the other hand, was a hot-headed asshole who would occasionally show up, kick the cook out of the kitchen, and play chef. He was terrible at cooking. His wife did her best to keep him away from the place, but he did whatever he wanted. Luckily for everyone, he was lazy, and running a restaurant is hard work, so he wasn't around much. One slow morning, when I was the only server, he came in to cook breakfast, and he was just ruining everything. He was smoking a cigar in the kitchen, dumping way too much grease on everything, and burning food left and right. Customers would order something as simple as scrambled eggs and bacon, and he'd hand me plates of blackened, greasy mystery substances. I refused to take it out at first, but he screamed at me, loud enough for customers to hear, that he was the restaurateur, not me, so I'd better do what I was told. So I took the disgusting food to the tables. The customers complained, asking me to replace it, and gave me this look like they couldn't believe I'd even brought it out in the first place. I brought it back, and the hothead couldn't believe they didn't want it. He yelled at me, insisting they were wrong. I refused to take it back out and told him he could do it himself. He didn't like that, but he did it. And sure enough, when the customers told him the same thing they told me, he completely lost it. He shouted at them, ranting about how they didn't know what real food was, how he grew up in Greece where food was an art, how he went to culinary school and owned restaurants, and who the hell were they to question his cooking? He told them his restaurant was only for people who truly appreciated food and that they should go eat somewhere else. They left in silence, clearly too stunned to respond. When he came back, he told me I was on thin ice and he didn't appreciate my backtalk. He said if I didn't like the way he ran things, I could just leave. Well, I was the only server there. I was so pissed off I couldn't even think straight. And since he'd just told me to leave if I didn't like it, I did exactly that. Apparently, he hadn't realized I was the only server, because shortly after, I started getting voicemails from him saying it was all a misunderstanding and begging me to come back because they were busy. How they were busy with no servers, I have no idea. The messages grew more and more desperate. Luckily, I had another job at the time, so I just picked up more shifts there. Hours later, I finally answered one of his calls, told him I was working my other job, and said flat out I wasn't coming back, so he should stop calling. Later, ex-coworkers told me that his wife came in, realized what happened, broke down crying, and shut the restaurant down for the rest of the day. That part actually made me feel bad. She was a genuinely nice lady, and I can only imagine how hard it must have been for her to try to run a restaurant while dealing with a husband like that. Story 17. Worked at Subway right out of high school. I became really good friends with one of the girls there. We were always the closers, and honestly, it was a clusterfuck from day one. Our manager was this bitchy woman in her late 20s who thought she was the biggest badass on earth just because she managed a Subway. Things had been bad for a while. We got blamed for everything. Anything that went wrong was our fault, because if she was there in the mornings, the morning crew couldn't possibly have messed up. We'd routinely be stuck until 1 a.m., cleaning up all the crap the morning crew didn't do, without pay. She made us clock out half an hour after close, but we'd still be working hours past that to catch up. My friend and I constantly talked about quitting, and we made a pact. If one of us quit, the other would too. The breaking point came in two waves. First, we got audited. The audit happened in the morning, and the morning crew screwed everything up so badly it was a total failure. Of course, who got blamed? Us. We got yelled at like it was our fault, because this manager never took responsibility for anything. Then, the regional manager decided to send a secret shopper during our shift. We didn't know. The next day, when we came in, the regional manager was on the phone with our store manager and wanted to talk to us. On speaker, he said the secret shopper raved about us. Customer service? Excellent. Store? Spotless. Even with a long line, we were fast and kept people engaged so the wait didn't feel long. He congratulated us and said he was really impressed. Our manager hated that. She immediately brought up the audit again and tried to blame us. That night, my friend said she was quitting the next day. And she did. She came in wearing normal clothes, carrying a bag with her Subway uniform inside. The manager came back from the bank or something, saw her sitting in the dining area with a shit-eating grin, and knew immediately what was up. They went into the back, and my friend just unloaded on her, yelling, screaming, tearing her apart by pointing out that she knew more about how to run the store than the manager herself. She even called her out on illegally withholding pay. The manager screamed that she'd get her paycheck in 2 weeks, but my friend had done her research. Where we live, employers have to provide wages within 2 days of quitting or termination. My friend left, and later that night, after the dinner rush, the manager called me to the back and said, "Can you believe she would do something like that?" I looked at her and said, "Of course I can. You're a horrible manager. You never take responsibility. You dump everything on us. You illegally make us work without pay. And you're just an unpleasant person to be around. Get off your high horse. It's a Subway, bitch." Then I handed her my apron and told her I'd wash my shirt and bring it back when I came to pick up my wages. Called my friend, went to her place, and we high-fived all night. 2 days later, we went together to get our wages. Everyone there smiled at us like we were heroes. Life moved on. I went to college, got a great job. Years later, I walked into a Taco Bell for lunch, and guess who I saw? Old manager, working behind the counter as an assistant manager. She saw me in a suit and tie, looking sharp, while she was stuck there. That moment made my month. I immediately called my friend, and we had the biggest laugh. I'm not a terrible person, but that woman was a mega tool. And seriously, it was a fucking Subway. Story 18. I was working in a call center for about a year between high school and college. I started out doing phone plan support, then moved to internet tech support, and eventually ended up in escalations and billing disputes. The escalations department was a nightmare. Half the calls were terrible people screaming at you, and the other half were good people who'd been royally screwed by the company's policies. Telecom support procedures are brutally unforgiving. The company knows it, too, and if you didn't play along and help them screw people, you risked getting fired if a call was being monitored live or reviewed later. By the time I got accepted into college, I knew I'd be quitting. One evening at the start of my shift, I got a call that changed everything. A woman who had been a loyal customer for 15 years, never missed a bill, had both internet and phone service, only ever called in for normal issues, was being billed over $5,000 in long-distance charges. Her story was heartbreaking. She had taken in a refugee to help them get on their feet. She thought she had a long-distance plan, but she didn't. The refugee had been calling home daily, sometimes multiple times a day, talking to their family for 30 minutes to 2 hours at a time at $3 per minute. You can do the math. $3 times 60 minutes times 30 days equals over $5,000 in a single month. This woman was not wealthy. Her husband had died a few years back. I saw the note on her account. She had to fax in his death certificate to get the bill switched into her name. Based on her DOB, she was nearing elderly age. She had already been on the phone for over 40 minutes before reaching me, with every rep telling her basically, "Tough luck, pay up." My limit for credits was $100 without approval, and I knew there was no way management would approve wiping out $5,000. Standard procedure was to send her to collections and cut her off. But I couldn't do that. I told her flat out, "It's your lucky day." I went into the system, backdated a $10 per month worldwide long-distance plan onto her account, and reissued her invoices so it looked like a billing error. With that, I could legally code it as a refund adjustment. Her $5,000 bill dropped to about $50, and I even waived the monthly fee for that plan. When I told her, she broke down crying, thanking me over and over, saying she'd pray for me and wishing me luck in school. I'm not religious, but man, that moment felt incredible. My manager, who was actually pretty cool despite working for a shitty company, had listened to the whole call live. Afterward, she came over and said, "You know you broke policy, right? Why'd you do it?" I told her, "For the same reason you listened to the entire call and didn't stop me. And as you already heard, I got accepted to college. I'm leaving." She nodded, smiled, wished me luck in school, and went back to her computer. A few minutes later, she deleted the call history and marked it as disconnected. Story 19. A few years back, I worked at a group home for mentally disabled young adults, usually between 16 and 27. The job was brutal, but also incredibly rewarding. We were short-staffed constantly, so it wasn't unusual to work 50 to 60 hours a week, sometimes more. The bonds we formed with the residents were deep. Being with them 12 to 16 hours a day nearly every day does that. I ended up working there 3 years, getting promoted to management after my first. For most of that time, things were fine, typical workplace drama, but toward the end, the whole place started spiraling. Administration was a disaster, incompetent, contradictory, and often throwing staff under the bus. Each resident had a 70-page binder full of their history, needs, triggers, and preferences, but none of it matched what we were actually told, including their medical records. Leaving the job was tough because of the residents, but ultimately, administration pushed me out. Background: in the past, we'd sometimes had to work 16 to 24-hour shifts. Eventually, admin told us OSHA guidelines made that illegal, so we had to leave once we hit 16 hours. On my last day, it was about 10 p.m. I was in my office finishing paperwork. Earlier, one resident, a 19-year-old, 6 feet tall, mostly muscle, had gone on a rampage. One staffer ended up in the hospital with a shoulder injury. Another had his shirt ripped clean off, and I had a black eye, bruises, and bite wounds all up my arm. We were exhausted and just wanted to go home. At 10:15, one overnight staff arrived. Since all the residents were asleep, I let the remaining day staff go. At 10:30, my 16th hour, I was still waiting for the last person to relieve me. By 10:45, still no sign, so I called. Straight to voicemail. By 11 o'clock, I called the on-call administrator to report it. She told me the other homes were short too, so no one could come, and I couldn't leave because that would put us out of ratio. I reminded her I was scheduled from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. the next day and needed rest. I asked if she could come cover. Her response? Just, "No, that's it." So I stayed. Exhausted, bruised, bandaged, I sat at my desk until 7 a.m. when it was time to get the residents up for school. For context, the facility was set up like a college dorm with an atrium leading to the school building. Once residents crossed into the school, they were officially in the teacher's care and we could leave. Instead, I stayed. I logged everything, prepped schedules, sat through meetings. By then I'd been there about 26 hours. I drank 2 cups of coffee and popped an Adderall a med student coworker slipped me. Don't judge desperation. At 2 p.m., a teacher called. One of our residents had stripped naked and dropped to the floor screaming, refusing to move. They evacuated the classroom but needed someone to supervise him. I told her to get a teacher. She said none were available. I suggested an admin. She said none were available. So I trudged over, already at 32 hours on shift, and sat in a classroom with a naked, screaming 20-year-old who would charge at anyone who got too close. My body ached, my wounds throbbed, and I was barely hanging on. An hour later, guess who walked in? The very administrator who had left me stranded the night before. For a second, I thought she was finally relieving me. Nope. She was there to tell me OSHA would file a claim if I logged all my hours, since I'd gone over 16, so I couldn't log the 8 overnight hours. My brain, sleep-deprived, bruised, and running on fumes, snapped. I stood up, walked behind her, gave her a gentle shove into the classroom, turned to the resident, and said, "See you later, buddy." Then I shut the door behind her. I walked back to my office, grabbed my stuff, and walked straight out the front door without looking back. It was fucking brutal. Even writing this makes me cringe. And yeah, I'll admit, I half expected the resident to go after her when I left him with her. But it didn't quite work out that way. Story 20. I used to work at a movie theater, and the managers there were absolutely terrible at their jobs, constantly making scheduling mistakes. That was one of the main reasons I quit. I was hired for weekdays, but they always scheduled me for 10-hour weekend shifts. For 6 months, I asked every single week to be put on Monday through Friday, and every single week they ignored me. By February, I was already on the verge of quitting. Then came the breaking point. There was a massive blizzard one weekend, and a buddy of mine who was working texted me. He told me one of our regulars, a mentally challenged guy who came often, had pissed himself again during a movie, and this time it was a big one. The managers were freaking out, refusing to clean it themselves, and they couldn't make the floor staff do it because everyone working that day was under 18, and minors legally aren't allowed to handle bodily fluids. 5 minutes later, I got a call from a manager telling me I needed to come in. I tried to use the blizzard as an excuse, but they weren't having it. What I didn't know at the time was that there were no 18-plus staff working, and the mess hadn't been touched yet. They just needed me there to clean it. The second I clocked in, they started their little act. One manager faked a conversation in front of me. "Aw man, Doug is here for the Lego movie again. Let's hope he doesn't have another accident." 5 minutes later, another manager just happened to come back and say, "Aw man, Doug pissed in the seat again. I can't believe it," while the first one put on this fake surprised reaction. That's when I realized they had called me in just to deal with it. I reluctantly walked into the theater. The smell hit me first, absolutely foul. Then I saw it. It wasn't just piss. The back of the seat was coated in thick diarrhea that looked like melted chocolate mixed with oatmeal. That was my line. I stood there, stared at it, and thought, minimum wage is not worth cleaning up disabled people's shit and piss every week. I walked straight back out. I told the managers I wasn't doing it and that I quit. They started yelling, calling me lazy, saying it was my responsibility since it happened on my shift. I pulled out my phone and read them the text from my buddy, proving the whole thing had happened before I ever clocked in. They just stood there in silence, caught in their lie. And then, the perfect finale. As we were standing in the hallway arguing, right outside the bathrooms, Doug himself walked out. He had shit smeared all over the front of his shirt and was furious. He started yelling about how he'd been waiting in the bathroom for a long time and nobody came to help him. The managers immediately switched to begging me not to quit right then and there. I couldn't stop laughing. I put on my coat and walked out while Doug screamed, "Now! Now!" at the managers, demanding they help him clean up. One of those managers quit a few minutes after I did. Story 21. I was an online community manager for a Facebook games company. We had one pretty successful title and several others that were less so. I genuinely loved the job. I was good at it, my community loved me, and I loved them. The backend of the games wasn't very stable, though, so there were constant fires to put out on the forums about lost items, missing currency, or wiped progress. I was the extinguisher. To give you an idea, once, when the company changed how user data was stored, we lost all the data for a huge chunk of players. No backups. Our support team was drowning in tickets for weeks, trying to rebuild accounts from scratch. My job was to keep players from setting the forums on fire. Meanwhile, the owners were trying to scale quickly so they could sell before the Facebook gaming bubble burst. They made rash changes, hired a new CEO, and generally played musical chairs with priorities. I didn't mind the new CEO, though. When I got fed up and asked to speak with him, he actually listened. I sat in his office venting for 90 minutes straight, and he took notes. I left impressed, but the owners found out I had spoken with him, and that sealed my fate. Not 10 minutes after leaving his office, I was called into a meeting with my direct boss. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I was told the company was unhappy with my work and I needed to improve immediately, or I'd be demoted back to customer support. This was complete bullshit. I'd been in the role nearly a year and had only ever been spoken to once about a minor slip-up. It was obvious this was one of the owners trying to put me in my place. They didn't fire me outright, likely because they were afraid one of their senior developers, would walk. I went home pissed, slept on it, and came back the next morning before most people arrived. I quit, asked if I could say goodbye to my community. They said no. So I deactivated my forum account, deleted my work Facebook, which had thousands of players as friends. My profile pic was the first thing many saw when they logged in, and left. The icing on the cake? That day was the 1-year anniversary celebration and big content release for our most successful game. And the boards absolutely exploded. Players spammed threads asking, "Where is she? What happened to Zekos? My username?" People ignored the anniversary content completely. "Screw your update. Bring back Zekos." The community went full riot mode. They somehow got a hold of the company's office phone number, not public, and called from all over the world trying to find me. They bombarded support and every company email address they could dig up. They filled the forums with "Bring back Zekos" threads, and thousands of players changed their profile pictures to mine. My face was everywhere. Work in the office ground to a halt as staff watched in horror, trying to figure out how to contain it. Meanwhile, I was at home in sweatpants, crying into comfort food, watching the chaos unfold. I loved my community, and it broke my heart to disappear like that. But I wasn't going to be bullied into a demotion for daring to have an opinion. Their big anniversary release flopped. Less than 2 years later, the company went under and the owners fled the country. And I like to think my exit gave them a nice, hard shove toward the cliff. Story 22. A moment that changed my life. 15 years ago, I was fresh out of college, working as a software programmer for a small company in New York City. There were 2 owners and about 30 employees. Looking back, I honestly think smaller companies are the worst when it comes to abuses of power, and this place was no exception. The partners were psychologically abusive. One of them I'm pretty sure was outright psychotic. She had unbeatable 20/20 hindsight. Whenever an unexpected problem arose, her response was always, "Any idiot would have known that would happen. We're trying to hire professionals here. How can you consider yourself a professional?" Deadlines were impossible by design, mandatory overtime was the norm, and since we were salaried, there was no overtime pay. You even had to ask permission to have Saturdays off. It was a Dickens novel with computers. Early that spring, I was supposed to fly home in 2 weeks to be best man at my brother's wedding. That's when the owner called me into his office. The meeting was short and brutal. "Your project is overdue. We don't think you're giving us 100%, so we're canceling your vacation unless you get it done." That's it. You'd think I wouldn't have been surprised, given how things were, but I was. I went back to my cubicle in shock. My first thought was that I had to call my brother and tell him I couldn't make it. I couldn't imagine the words. Then I thought maybe I could go back to the bosses and beg. Surely we could work something out. While my brain was scrambling, my eyes landed on a picture I had pinned to the wall. A young Hunter S. Thompson, not yet famous, standing in front of a docked boat. A random thought crept in. What would Hunter do in this situation? My immediate response was, that's meaningless. Hunter would never end up in a situation like this. And then the thought came back. Why not? Cue record scratch. Why not? What was the difference between the way he lived his life and the way I was living mine? I didn't have an answer. So I took the pictures down, stuffed them into my gym bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked out. Down the elevator, into the sunlit streets of Manhattan at lunchtime. I walked a few blocks to Port Authority and boarded a bus to Atlantic City. I stayed at the Taj Mahal Casino for 4 days playing poker. On the second day, my phone rang. It was the psychotic partner. I didn't answer. They never called again. A week later, I was home for my brother's wedding. Did this act of rebellion hurt my career? Not at all. I moved on to bigger and better jobs. But more important than that, it shifted how I see the world. Over the years, I've worked on answering the question that stopped me cold that day. What is it about great people that allows them to achieve more, to live more freely? I think the answer is this. They don't see the boundaries that aren't really there. Story 23. Gonna get buried, but it's still the ballsiest thing I've ever done. My so and I worked for the same small, family-owned business. He was a technician. I worked in admin, less than 10 staff total, including the bosses, when they bothered to show up. We'd both taken pay cuts to be there. Mine was about 40%, but the hours meant I didn't have to pay for childcare, so it sort of balanced until summer came and I was pressured into staying an extra hour every day. That extra $17 an hour cost me $48 in after-school care. My so was averaging 11 to 14-hour days. The overtime made his pay decent, but he was constantly under the pump. We'd originally loved the company because they sold themselves as family-friendly. That illusion broke the first time he got called back from holiday for a big contract. It happened twice, and we were dumb enough to be the only ones who ever answered the phone. Things soured fast. He was pressured into doing a highly risky, unnecessary treatment, while the two senior techs cherry-picked the easy jobs, cut corners, and earned way more. Turnover was constant. Morale was shit, and the stress bled into our relationship. We ended up separating for a short time, me staying at my mom's with the kids, him moving his stuff out. The bosses found out we were living separately when I mentioned it in passing. Not long after, I called in sick because the commute from my mom's was 3 hours and I was wrecked. Boss said it was fine, told me to rest. That night my so called, panicked. He'd been told to meet one of the bosses first thing the next day. He was worried they'd fire him. I laughed it off, but he was right. They fired him on the spot. Bullshit excuses, none of them legal. He lost his job, the company UDA, everything. I walked into the office the next morning, early, shaking with rage. Boss was sitting there smug. I demanded to know what the fuck was going on. His response: all the employees agreed you'd need more support than so during the separation. We chose to back you. He'll find work quicker than you could, and you'd struggle more without income. I lost it. How dare they assume what I wanted? How dare they make me the excuse for firing him? How dare they rip food out of my kids' mouths with this shit? I told him it was a cunt's move to take away the one stable thing my so had left while we were already struggling. Then I absolutely tore into him. Years of pent-up frustration poured out. He was stunned. They'd only ever seen my professional face, never my fury. Finally, I took the office keys off my ring, threw them on his desk, and told him I quit. Effective immediately. He was shell-shocked, begged me to reconsider 5 or 6 times. Every time, I refused harder. I told him point blank, in 2 years, you'll realize this was the turning point of your company going downhill. I guarantee you'll regret it. And I walked out. They even tried to underpay my so by $2,200 in his final check. I sent them an email citing labor law and warned I'd lodge a Fair Work complaint for illegal termination, which could have cost them tens of thousands. A week later, we went back together to collect our stuff and uniforms. They handed over a check for the exact amount they'd shorted him. My tough as nails boss couldn't even look at me. That was satisfying. After leaving, so and I worked through our issues. Most of the problems between us evaporated once that toxic job was gone. 2 months later, we launched our own business, direct competition. 5 months in, we'd already taken a big chunk of their customers. We offer transparency, honesty, quality, and actual customer service. And honestly, I don't think it'll take them 2 years to regret it. They already are. Story 24. I had a job my freshman and sophomore year of college at a dress store that owned 3 locations within an hour of each other. My role didn't even have an official title. The owner wasn't computer savvy and wanted to transition his business online, so I became the de facto webmaster and digital manager. I uploaded dresses, processed orders, managed his UPS account, Dropbox, and more. On top of that, since I had Photoshop and some design skills, I also made posters, edited photos, designed his logo and business cards, created ads, ran social media, handled email campaigns, you name it, for $10 an hour. And the owner was a complete nightmare. He screamed at me constantly, often over miscommunications caused by his limited English. One day, he'd berate me for not asking questions before taking action. The next, he'd scream at me for not taking initiative. He gaslit, insulted me in our shared mother tongue, and treated everyone like trash. I'll never forget when he harassed our web coder for weeks because the site wasn't up on his timeline. She'd literally been in the hospital after a near-fatal accident, and he still demanded proof in the form of a hospital photo before he'd stop. Most staff didn't last long under him. His most senior worker, though, a woman who'd been there for years, became my lifeline. She drove me between stores, confided that she didn't need the job, and, now pregnant, admitted she hated how stressful it was becoming. She reassured me often that he was the unreasonable one. One weekend, I came down from college to do another big website update. Despite his abuse, I still cared about the store's success after all the work I'd poured into it. But during a phone call that didn't go his way, he snapped. He screamed at me, accusing me of stressing him out, making him ill, not meeting his standards. I had confronted him earlier, asking him to stop disrespecting me, so now he added my attitude to the list of sins. For the first time, I yelled back. He spewed even more vile comments, and that's when the senior worker, pregnant, exhausted, and done, stepped in. She shouted at him, called his behavior disgusting, and when he turned his wrath on her, she quit on the spot. She grabbed her things, apologized to me, and walked out. He immediately tried to backpedal with her, but she was gone. Then he turned on me, raging louder than ever. But by then, I'd had enough. I calmly packed my things, ignored his tirade, looked him dead in the eye, and in our native tongue told him, "Why do you constantly blame others for your own incompetence?" Then I walked out. I was shaking, but once the adrenaline wore off, I felt nothing but relief. In a single day, he lost his senior worker and me, the only two people with the skills and experience to keep his stores and online platform afloat. Sure, I could have been petty and nuked his files. I probably still had access, but I didn't, because I know he'll fail all on his own. His leadership guarantees it. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, activate the notification bell, and share a similar story or anything you'd like to say in the comments. See you next time.